And now, Light of My Life. Light of My Life. The true-to-life story of men and women living their span of years in Pine City, a typical small Midwestern community, where suddenly yesterday, Dr. Duncan reappeared after several days' absence.
Why are you people destroying my Volkswagen?
You'll recall, Dr. Duncan was called before the doctor board in State Center because he had begun to enjoy wearing Mrs. Heuser's dresses.
It looks nice on you, Dr. Duncan.
And so, Dr. Duncan, it was assumed, went to State Center in order to appear before that board. However, he did not appear before the board. As a matter of fact, he totally disappeared.
Where have you been, Dr. Duncan?
Well, today, Dr. Duncan has reappeared alongside his abandoned automobile.
We're sorry about destroying your Volkswagen, Dr. Duncan.
Which his fellow townsfolk had completely destroyed in searching for clues as to his whereabouts.
Dr. Duncan.
And so today, naturally, T. Howard Pines Jr. asks the all-important question.
I want you to tell us about the thing that happened to you in State Center.
Well,
That doggone organ fill.
I'm sorry, is the music sort of inappropriate?
try that one, Dr. Duncan.
I don't want to talk about that thing that happened to me in State Center.
Of course,
All right,
this
fine.
entire episode began because Dr. Duncan was examining Mrs. Heuser.
Want to talk about that, Charles?
In the course of redressing, Dr. Duncan inadvertently put on Mrs. Heuser's dress.
I still feel nauseous, Dr. Duncan, and I have a kicking in my stomach, and I'm getting fat.
And so, Dr. Duncan, being the outstanding medical practitioner that he is,
I suspect something may be wrong.
says that he suspects something may be wrong with Mrs. Heuser.
Why don't you show up at the hospital, Mrs. Heuser, and we'll take some tests.
All right, and on my way over there, I'll get a pickle sandwich.
And so, Dr. Duncan drives his now battered automobile to the hospital
I got it.
and waits in his office for the arrival of Mrs. Heuser.
Come in.
Hi, I'm ready for my test, Dr. Duncan.
All right, here is the test. If you fail this test, there may be a possibility, Mrs. Heuser. I don't want to alarm you, but you might be pregnant. Question 1 of the test. What was the name of the great American hero of the Battle of Ticonderoga? Question number 2. Chicago is 2,180 miles from San Francisco. If motorist A leaves Chicago driving west at 50 miles an hour, and motorist B leaves San Francisco going east at 55 miles an hour, when will they meet? Question number 3. What is the name of the process whereby plants convert sunlight into energy?
Well, Dr. Duncan has put Mrs. Heuser through a test,
Oh, boy, this is a tough test.
which she now must take some time to consider before answering.
I think the hero of Ticonderoga was H.R. Bob Haldeman. I think those two motorists will meet Tuesday at 7:30. And I think the name of the process whereby plants convert sunshine into energy is called Frank.
Well, did Mrs. Heuser pass the test? What was the terrible thing that happened to Dr. Duncan in State Center? Will he get restitution
That's a nice word.
for his car?
Yeah, it's a good word.
Be sure to join us tomorrow when we'll hear Mrs. Heuser say,
Mr. Heuser, I flunked the test. I'm pregnant.
"And now, light of my life." Light of my life. The true-to-life story of men and women living their span of years in Pine City, a typical small Midwestern community. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday's episode violated one of the basic tenets, we feel, of soap opera,
Yes, we tried to do too many elements.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan.
That's all right.
You see, Dr. Duncan had returned from his mysterious disappearance to we know not where, and found many of his friends tearing up his car.
Oh, we destroyed Dr. Duncan's Volkswagen.
They were looking for clues as to Dr. Duncan's whereabouts.
I was convinced we'd find his body stuffed in the Volkswagen.
That's T. Howard Pines, Jr., hospital administrator in Pine City.
A terrible thing happened to me in State Center.
And so today, let us ask Dr. Duncan to tell us, if he would, what was the terrible thing that happened to him in State Center.
I can't talk about it.
Well, then, moving right along,
I don't feel good.
Mrs. Heuser told us that she didn't feel well.
I'm nauseous all the time. My stomach's getting big. I feel a kicking inside. And I have a craving for pickles.
And so Dr. Duncan took her to the hospital where she underwent a series of tests.
All right, this first test, I want you to answer these questions. Who was the hero of the Battle of Ticonderoga?
Donald Segretti.
Wrong.
Chicago is 2,900 miles from San Francisco. If motorist A leaves Chicago driving west at 50 miles an hour and driver B drives east from San Francisco at 60 miles an hour, when will they meet?
They'll meet at a party Wednesday night.
Wrong.
Name the process by which plants convert sunlight into energy. I need the name.
Debbie.
Wrong.
I'm sorry. Mrs. Heuser, you failed the test. You're pregnant.
Well, Mrs. Heuser is pregnant. How does Mr. Heuser react to this news that he is about to be a father?
Mm-hmm.
We find Mr. Heuser going now to the office of the attorney Graydon Ballback.
Verily I say unto thee, Graydon, I just receiveth news from the hospital. Mrs. Heuser has failed her test and is pregnant.
Well, why did you come to see me about that, Mr. Heuser?
Because, Graydon, that child is not mine.
All right, now, do we all understand what has happened? Dr. Duncan, will you tell us of that thing that happened to you?
I can't talk about
He won't talk about it. But we do know Mrs. Heuser is pregnant. And Mr. Heuser says he is not the father of that child. Well, be sure to join us Monday when we will hear Dr. Duncan say...
We tried to do too much on Friday's episode.
It's time for Light of My Life. Light of My Life, the true-to-life story of men and women living their span of years in Pine City, a typical small Midwestern community. Well, as you'll recall, Dr. Duncan continues to refuse to talk about the thing that happened to him in State Center.
I don't want to talk about it.
However, he has put Mrs. Heuser through a series of tests.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Heuser, you flunked your test.
Meaning that Mrs. Heuser is with child.
You're pregnant, Mrs. Heuser.
She's going to have a baby.
Oh.
And her husband, Mr. Heuser, is in the office of Graydon Ballback, the attorney in Pine City.
Seem somewhat perturbed today, Mr. Heuser.
Graydon asks Mr. Heuser why he appears to be perturbed.
Verily I say unto thee, Graydon,
Mr. Heuser responds.
I've received alarming news.
Alarming news?
Alarming news.
And what might that be?
Well, my wife, Mrs. Heuser, took a test at the Pine City Hospital today and flunked. Therefore, Dr. Duncan says that she is pregnant.
Well, that must be joyous news to you, Mr. Heuser.
But is it joyous news as Graydon assumes it must be?
Verily I say it's not, Graydon, because it's not my child. You see, Graydon, our marriage has never been consummated.
I believe that's consummated. Mr.
Oh, really?
Heuser. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Never been consummated.
Well, that leaves you in a dilemma, Mr. Heuser.
A dilemma indeed.
You can do the following. You can either, 1, get a divorce, 2, a trial separation, Or 3, make a citizen's arrest.
Well, what will Mr. Heuser decide to do? Meanwhile, in the Heuser House of Antiques, Mrs. Heuser, with child, is busily going about the business of cataloging her antiques. When the door opens, the little bell tinkles, and in walks her husband, Mr. Heuser.
Verily I say unto thee. Yes. Why are you pointing that gun at me, Mr. Heuser?
Oh, what's this?
Verily, Mrs. Heuser, you're under arrest.
Well, he had an option, 3 things that Mr. Heuser might do. And he has decided on making a citizen's arrest. What does this mean? Be sure to join us tomorrow when we'll hear Mrs. Heuser say,
You'll never take me alive, Mr. Heuser.
"And now, light of my life." Light of my life, the true-to-life story of men and women living their span of years in Pine City, a typical small Midwestern community. As you'll recall, Dr. Duncan has diagnosed Mrs. Heuser's problem.
She's pregnant.
She is with child. Mr. Heuser
Verily.
was much concerned by that revelation.
It cannot be my child, since our marriage has never been consummated.
Consummated,
Oh, pardon
Mr.
me.
Heuser. And so, Mr. Heuser went for legal advice to Graydon Ballback.
You have a choice, Mr. Heuser. You can get a divorce, a legal separation, or you can make a citizen's arrest.
And so Mr. Heuser goes to the Heuser House of Antiques to confront Mrs. Heuser, takes with him Officer Mulder, and they do indeed make a citizen's arrest as they enter the Heuser House of Antiques.
Well, hi, Mr. Heuser. Verily I say unto thee, Mrs. Heuser, you're under arrest. That's really remarkable. It's never happened.
Mrs. Heuser apparently doesn't realize the gravity of the situation.
Verily, this is a very serious situation. Officer Mulder will throw the book at you.
What's this? Officer Mulder throws the book at Mrs. Heuser,
Peggy O'Neill, take that, Mrs. Heuser.
and indeed does.
You missed, Officer